thoughts and prayers go out to him and his family in this tough time. But we do have with us today Tom Fitton, President of Judicial Watch, who will be testifying here today about the body of work that he is conducting as it relates to the use of Clinton Foundation as a vehicle for pay-to-play transactions. And finally, Mr. Philip Hackney, an associate professor of law at the University of Pittsburgh. He rounds out our first panel and will discuss the allegations against the Trump Foundation that we have, where there has been the subject of media reports as well. The committee has also received over 1,300 pages of documents from the whistleblowers' claims that they've submitted to the IRS. These documents are part of a larger 48-page whistleblower claim submission with 95 formal exhibits, as much as approximately 6,000 pages of documents, and the claims allege abuse of charitable organization status by the Clinton Foundation. To further discuss their claims, we'll be joined by Mr. Lawrence Doyle and Mr. John Monahan on a separate panel following our current witnesses. I'd like to thank everyone for being here today and look forward to your testimony. I now recognize the ranking member, my good friend, Mr. Conley, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this, I guess, may be your last hearing as chairman of the subcommittee. And
I'm glad you added the last part of that.
I certainly look forward to working with you again in the new Congress. Unfortunately, I don't really look forward to working with you today. You know, here we are a few weeks before Christmas, and my Republican friends are regifting an old trope that needs desperate reworking. They've found nothing, but that doesn't stop them from trying to do it again. And of course, Mr. Cummings and I have repeatedly requested that we have witnesses from the Trump Foundation and from FACTS, Mr. Whitaker's foundation, before us. If we're going to be looking at nonprofit foundations, let's actually look at some that have outstanding allegations, including a pending criminal investigation against them, unlike the Clinton administration. So let's look at this latest so-called set of allegations with respect to the Clinton Foundation. This next panel has two private individuals, both Republicans, the panel after this, who will explain how they submitted a complaint to the IRS and the FBI against the Clinton Foundation. They have already conceded that they are not whistleblowers. Instead, they are would-be plaintiffs in a lawsuit seeking to make money. That's not a whistleblower. They also admit they have no firsthand knowledge of any wrongdoing. Their first claim is that internal reports issued a decade ago suggest that there were mismanagement challenges at the foundation. These internal reports were already leaked by WikiLeaks long ago. The Clinton Foundation commissioned these reports internally, voluntarily, and then made substantial improvements to address their findings. That's neither a scandal nor new. Next, they claim there was a quid pro quo between the Clinton Foundation and its donors. But that's not what these reports said. They said some employees raised concerns about donors who, quote, may have an expectation of quid pro quo benefit in return for gifts. No evidence exists of any such quid pro quo, but rather employees who said some donors might have had expectation, even if unfulfilled. Nevertheless, that doesn't stop some from trying to smear, yet again, the Clinton name. Next, they will report on a secret interview they conducted with the chief financial officer of the foundation, Andy Kessel, during a breakfast in 2016. They claim Mr. Kessel made statements criticizing President Bill Clinton and the foundation. They claim that Mr. Kessel stated, and I quote, "I know where all the bodies are buried," unquote. My Lord. But Mr. Kessel denies saying this. And all we have to contradict him is a one-page summary submitted as part of the complaint by these Republican litigants in the lawsuit. So what did the IRS and FBI do with the complaint? The IRS rejected it. According to the testimony of these two gentlemen, the IRS sent them a denial letter. They said that they have appealed, but they've refused to give us a copy of their original complaint or their appeal. How about the FBI? Well, apparently the FBI interviewed the Clinton Foundation CFO last year, but like the IRS, took no further action that we know of. The chairman invited the Justice Department to be here today. They refused to come. The Trump Justice Department refused to send someone to this hearing. I will agree with the chairman. When a request is made by this committee to the executive branch, it should always be honored unless there are extraordinary circumstances. But I suspect one of the reasons they're not here is because there's no there there, and they don't want to have to testify to that fact, given the pillaring President Trump has engaged in with respect to the Clintons personally. Finally, there's one last allegation, Mr. Chairman. 2 days ago, John Solomon wrote an opinion piece in The Hill, a newspaper here in The Hill, claiming that the Clinton Foundation somehow misled the IRS based on state regulatory filing errors. This was reported 2 years ago. One tax expert, Professor James Fishman, summarized the allegations then as, quote, minor infractions equivalent to reporting someone who was issued a traffic ticket for parking 15 inches from the curb instead of the statutory 12. Unfortunately, this is part of a pattern. My friends on the other side of the aisle have been making unsubstantiated claims against the foundation for years. Last year, Republicans in this committee launched a joint investigation with the Intelligence Committee with claims of explosive new evidence from a confidential informant who could demonstrate Secretary Clinton orchestrated a quid pro quo with all 9 agencies of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States to approve the Uranium 1 deal. Remember that one? And corruptly direct millions of dollars to the foundation in return. My friends withheld their secret informant from us for months. But when we finally got the opportunity to interview that informant, his claims fell apart and failed to provide any evidence for the repeated and baseless claims. Before this hearing, I sent a letter to you, Mr. Chairman, asking if you planned on inviting the Clinton Foundation to also invite the Trump Foundation and the foundation operated by Acting Attorney General Matt Whitaker. There have been serious allegations against both, including a judicial ruling saying that a case against the Trump Foundation, in fact, can go forward. But unfortunately, those requests have fallen on barren soil. Just last month, a judge ruled, as I said, in New York State, that the Attorney General could proceed with its suit against the Trump Foundation for serious allegations of, and I quote the judge, not an informant, failure to operate and manage the foundation in accordance with corporate and statutory rules and their fiduciary obligations, resulting in misuse of charitable assets and self-dealing. Then the New York Times reported that Acting Attorney General Whitaker's former organization paid more than $1.2 million in dark money from anonymous conservative donors to target and defeat Democrats in elections. Instead, we have our umpteenth hearing on the latest Clinton conspiracy theory, and of course, we don't want to look at those charges. There's irony here. My friends, the Republican Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy justified the massive investigations, you will recall, into Hillary Clinton after Benghazi by touting his party's efforts to bring down her poll numbers. That was the motivation. They had 8 committees, including this one, and a select committee squandered millions of dollars and found very little. Yet now the Democrats are about to gain control. And Mr. McCarthy now says we should not investigate President Trump. That agenda, he says, would be too small. We should focus on other problems, like perhaps, once again, the Clintons. The truth is, there are very serious issues we ought to be investigating instead of this one. Chairman Meadows and Ranking Member Cummings sent a letter to the Trump administration seeking documents about their inhumane policy of separating immigrant children at the border. And I applaud you for that, Mr. Chairman, and I supported that effort. We did not get a single document. We were completely stymied. And despite our requests, no subpoenas were issued and no hearings held. Of course, it's the prerogative of the chairman of the full committee to call hearings, and he's chosen to call this one. Unfortunately, I trust, and I think most people, it looks like a last gasp at partisanship. I thank the chair.
So I thank the gentleman for his opening remarks, and so I'd like to make 2 very quick clarifications for my good friend, and I mean that in all sincerity. Mr. Huber's absence here today, if there's no there, is certainly not an excuse not to be here. I think the chairman would agree with that, because if that's the benchmark that we're going to use, then all we have to do is hear from them that there's no there and no one shows up. And I don't think that that's consistent on either way. I'd also like to highlight that if indeed we're here a little bit longer, which it appears that we're willing to do, I'm certainly willing to look at all of the foundation issues. I've signed on 22 bipartisan letters for oversight, probably the most of any Republican member in that regard, because I believe that oversight done properly is what we need to do. I want to make one clarification. If we're going to look at foundations, we do need to look at all of them. And I believe that we need to start where it's $2.5 billion on the Clinton Foundation versus $19 million on the Trump Foundation. There's a big disparity there in terms of overall revenues. And yet, I'm looking forward to cooperating with the new chairman, not to be presumptuous on government operations, in the new Congress where we do real oversight. And so I wanted to make sure that I clarified that. So, Mr. Fitton, you are recognized for your opening statement. Before we do that, I'm going to have you stand up. Both of you stand, please, Mr. Fitton, Mr. Hackney. If you'll stand, and I'll actually ask you, I'm going to swear you in now, and then I'll read your credentials after that. How about that? If you'll raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated. Let the record reflect that both witnesses answered in the affirmative. And so we're going to go ahead. Mr. Tom Fitton, you're the president of Judicial Watch. You are hereby recognized for 5 minutes. If you'll hit the red button.
Talk button, thank you. Thank you, Chairman Meadows, and thank you, Mr. Connolly, for conducting this hearing. Judicial Watch is a conservative, nonpartisan educational foundation dedicated to promoting transparency, accountability, and integrity in government politics and the law. Without a doubt, we're the most active Freedom of Information Act requester and litigator in the nation today. And it's no secret that Judicial Watch has had concerns over the years about the Clintons' ethics and respect for the rule of law. So it was with some skepticism we greeted promises by Hillary Clinton in 2008 and 2009 to conduct herself accordingly or appropriately with respect to the foundation as a condition of her being approved as Secretary of State, with some skepticism. At the time, even CNN reported that Bill Clinton's complicated business interests could present future conflicts of interest that result in unneeded headaches for the incoming Commander-in-Chief. And to reassure President Obama and senators from both parties, Mrs. Clinton agreed to not participate personally and substantially in any particular matter involving specific parties in which the William Clinton Foundation is a party or represents a party. And additionally, the Clintons promised that the President's speeches and business activities would undergo a State Department ethics review, and that the Clinton Foundation would disclose its donors online and agree to significant restrictions on support from foreign governments, neither of which, to be fair, it wasn't required by law, but was contingent on her being confirmed by the Senate. We obviously had zero confidence that these promises would be kept, and we began monitoring the ethics process and filed a Freedom of Information Act request in 2011 to see how that ethics process was being implemented. We were ignored for 2 years by the administration. We sued in 2013 and found something which wasn't terribly surprising to us, but still shocking, that former President Clinton gave 215 speeches and earned $48 million while his wife presided over U.S. foreign policy. Not one of those speeches was deemed a conflict of interest. That also included a consultancy with the controversial Clinton Foundation advisor Doug Band, who ran something called the Teneo Group. That consultancy ended after Teneo was caught up in a failed investment firm known as MF Global. State Department legal advisors approved Bill Clinton's speeches in China, in Russia, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, Panama, Turkey, Taiwan, India, the Cayman Islands, and other countries. The speeches, the approvals were routinely copied to Cheryl Mills, Hillary Clinton's senior counsel and chief of staff, who had been a foundation official, had negotiated the ethics agreement, which raised, again, conflicts of interest issues as to why she was involved in this process at all. The documents also show that Mr. Clinton received a staggering sums from Saudi benefactors, specifically between $18 million and $50 million were raised from the Saudis during this time period. While Mrs. Clinton served as Secretary of State, Bill Clinton gave 2 speeches in Saudi Arabia, earning a total of $600,000. He spoke at the Global Business Forum in Riyadh, founded by the Saudi Investment Authority and sponsored by the Bog Group, a commercial colossus with close ties to the Saudi family. He received $300,000 for that speech. There was one deal that was turned aside, but the exception in many ways proves the rule that this ethics process was no more than a rubber stamp to allow Bill Clinton to raise money from foreign corporations, mostly controlled or too often controlled by foreign governments. Specifically also, the documents show that he was approved to speak to something called Renaissance Capital, which is a Russian government-linked firm that it turns out later was connected to the Uranium One issue. Again, approved without comment by the so-called ethics process in the State Department. And then we found the Clinton email server. Judicial Watch litigation, to sum up, found the Clinton email server. Our Freedom of Information Act requests and lawsuits forced the State Department to admit they had all these emails they weren't telling anyone about. And also, another employee of the State Department who was participating in this server was Abidine, who, according to testimony she gave to Judicial Watch, needed it to conduct the Clintons' personal and family business. And to be sure, documents that we uncovered later as a result of uncovering the Clinton email server show the Clinton Foundation was in regular contact with Abidine and others in the State Department to get special favors and treatment for supporters and allies of the Foundation. Specifically, for instance, Gilbert Shigori, who was asked to be put in touch with the State Department substance person on Lebanon. This was by Doug Ban, the Clinton Foundation official. Ban notes that Shigori is a key guy there, Lebanon, and to us, and insists that Abidine call Ambassador Jeffrey Feltman to connect them to Shigori. Shigori is a close friend of President Clinton, a top donor to the Foundation. He appears near the top of the Foundation's donors list, gave between $1 and $5 million to the Foundation and pledged $1 billion to the Clinton Global Initiative. I don't know if he actually spent the money. He was convicted in 2000 in Switzerland on money laundering. So you can see that the Clinton Foundation, the Clinton State Department almost immediately broke promises to President Obama and the Senate to maintain a wall of separation between the Foundation and the State. We have numerous instances, it's detailed in my written testimony, of pay-to-play and favoritism for Clinton Foundation supporters with the Clinton State Department. It's so bad that the Crown Prince of Bahrain couldn't get a meeting directly with Mrs. Clinton through the State Department, so he went through the Clinton Foundation to try to get the meeting. Many have noted that it was hard to tell where the Clinton State Department ended and where the Clinton Foundation began, and this was in response to these disclosures, again, not of insider documents, but government documents that have been hidden from the American people. Then there's the Uranium One controversy, and specifically, it was a controversial 2010 Uranium One deal. There were monies that were funneled into the Clinton Foundation by Uranium One interests, specifically Mr. Frank Giestra, and these monies were hidden from the American people. The Foundation promised to disclose these monies in, as I said, this earlier agreement. $31.3 million was given to, for instance, the Foundation beginning in January 2008, or around the year 2008. We have the new documents, the document of the Renaissance Capital, $500,000, which is just the tip of the iceberg. And since then, both the New York Times has reported that Uranium One's chairman used his family's foundation to make 4 donations totaling $2.35 million to the Clinton operation. And of course, as I said, none of this was disclosed. And shortly after the Russians announced their intention to acquire the stake in Uranium One, Mr. Clinton received that $500,000 speaking fee from the Renaissance Capital organization. So we're asking for documents for Uranium One. We're getting the proverbial hand to the face from the administration on this. It's unfortunate that even the Trump administration doesn't want to divulge the full truth about this. But there is enough evidence to warrant serious investigations of the Clinton Foundation. And there is evidence that, in addition to this, that the Clinton Foundation investigations that may have been taking place during the Obama administration were suppressed by the Justice Department. So frankly, it's no surprise the Justice Department isn't here today. So I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Fitton. Mr. Hackney, you're recognized, and so I didn't say this, and I should have. If you will try to keep your oral testimony to 5 minutes, we'll be a little bit generous with you as well. And you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Meadows, Ranking Member Connolly, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me here today to talk about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, nonprofit oversight. My name is Philip Hackney, and I'm a professor of law at the University of Pittsburgh. I study, write, teach, and speak about tax law, and specialize in nonprofit organizations, and particularly with tax-exempt organizations. Though I am a professor, I worked for 5 years at the Office of the Chief Counsel of the IRS, looking over the tax-exempt sector. So I bring a wealth of experience. We wrote regulations, oversaw the policy of the IRS, and it was a very important time of my life, and I enjoyed the time working with that office. I additionally, before that, worked for Baker Botts, LLP, as a corporate attorney for 3 years, doing securities work and investigations into accounting irregularities. Now, I don't have much time. I've got 5 minutes. So let me cut to the chase. This is about oversight of nonprofit organizations. The IRS, as a practical matter, is seen as the nation's primary nonprofit regulator. Though the laws enacted by Congress and the regulations implemented by the IRS and Treasury could be improved, there's a real crisis in nonprofit organization oversight right now, which is that the budget is not sufficient to allow the IRS to do the job that needs to do well. It's not there. I have some numbers that you can see in my written testimony, but I'll use one fact from the, there was a great ProPublica piece, I don't know if you saw it the other day. It was called How the IRS Was Gutted, over a period of 8 years. And I'll use one number. The IRS today has fewer than 10,000 auditors. The last time it had that few auditors, 1953. 1953. For reference in terms of the exempt organization sector, this is the folks that are watching over these nonprofits that we're caring about today. They have in the range of 200 auditors, in the range of 200 determination specialists that are looking over this sector. So while the IRS presence has shrunk, the nonprofit world has gotten much bigger in that same period of time. There's over $3 trillion of assets in that sector, and about 5% of GDP takes place in there. There are over 1.8 million organizations that the IRS is overseeing within that world. The nonprofit sector is a terrific force for good. It's an incredible, small d, democratic effort at solving our problems in our nation's soup kitchens, in our churches, and in our schools. It's important that there be good oversight of this group. They take care of Americans daily in our lives, and it matters what happens. There are those who take advantage of these organizations or direct the organizations to their own self-interest, carry out their own things that they want to do. The law should be there to stop them from taking those actions, and when I worked at the IRS, they were working hard every day to do that activity. I know folks in state offices that were working hard every day to take care of that activity. But realistically, the amount of money, the resources that are just not there. They aren't, Mr. Chairman. I'm not certain what this subcommittee has in mind, hopes to accomplish through this hearing. A hearing on nonprofit oversight could do real good for this community. I see newspaper stories every day about people taking advantage of charities, and it breaks my heart when I see that happen. if this is going to be a tit for tat, showing this foundation that's conservative did this or this foundation that's liberal did that, it ain't going to help us. It just becomes a tit for tat political effort. I'd like to see these nonprofits operating better, and I hope it can be about that. Where's the IRS? Does the IRS have the right rules? Does the IRS have the right resources it needs to conduct the oversight? You're conducting the oversight over the folks who are conducting the oversight, and I don't think those folks have the resources they need, and there probably are things we could do about the laws as well. Almost at the end of my time. Let's talk about what role the IRS plays in nonprofits oversight and how we can improve that in function to ideally raise up our nonprofit sector and build confidence in American taxpayers that laws are evenly enforced every day. I'm worried that we have a real crisis on our hands with that nonprofit oversight, not as a matter of bias, but as a matter of just not having the resources to get the job done. They work hard every day, but they can't do everything. We're asking too much of them right now. They need more. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hackney. So you were at the IRS, you were over the 501c3 through 20, whatever the numbers are, section? Is that
Yes,
correct?
Mr. Chairman. I worked there from 2006 to 2011, and I was a senior technician reviewer towards the end, and wrote regulations into supporting organizations and dealt with,
Here in D.C.?
529s. Yes, I was in the national office.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Your former colleagues would be really happy with your opening statement. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, the vice chair of the Subcommittee on Government Operations, Mr. Heiss.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fitton, let me begin with you. I would assume that you're familiar with the Department of Justice Inspector General report that was released in February of 2018 pertaining to Andrew McCabe and the conversation he had
Yes.
pertaining to the
Yes.
Okay. There's some interesting information that is revealed in that report, specifically a telephone conversation that McCabe had with the Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General, possibly Matthew Axelrod, pertaining to the Clinton Foundation. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about in that conversation?
Yes.
Okay. Can you briefly describe what that conversation consisted of?
Well, according to the IG report, which I do quote in my testimony, they had this conversation regarding the Clinton Foundation investigation in August of 2016. McCabe said that the Justice Department expressed concerns about FBI agents taking overt steps in the Clinton Foundation investigation during the presidential campaign. According to McCabe, he pushed back asking, "Are you telling me that I need to shut down a validly predicated investigation?" McCabe told us, the IG, that the conversation was very dramatic. He had never had a similar confrontation before with DOJ. But prior to that, senior DOJ officials refused FBI requests to issue subpoenas on Clinton Foundation issues earlier in 2016, according to reports, and that, since then, supposedly there's been a new investigation launched, but I haven't seen any of the indicia of a serious investigation by the Justice Department yet.
Well, I would agree that that was a very dramatic conversation, and McCabe said, as you mentioned there, that he had never had a conversation like this in his career at the FBI. Do you believe that this demonstrates that the Justice Department was actively trying to protect the Clinton Foundation from an FBI investigation?
Yeah, it's just one of, I think, a few pieces of evidence demonstrating that the Clinton Foundation was being protected by the Justice Department, especially during that election year. These pay-to-play allegations, for instance, that we uncovered, these emails, they came out in August of 2016. Not that we timed them to come out in August 2016. That was a result of the Justice Department taking 8-9 months to release them to us, or the State Department taking 8-9 months to release them to us after they received them from Hillary Clinton and Ms. Abidine. So this was a very tricky time period, and so I can imagine there was pressure on the FBI and Justice Department to do something.
What, in your opinion, would be the reason that they were trying to protect the Clinton Foundation?
Well, the Justice Department at the time was working with the Clinton campaign to target President Trump. They were targeting President Trump. One of the key folks involved in that was Peter Strzok, who's had a demonstrated bias as an FBI official against Mr. Trump and for Mrs. Clinton. You know, the irony of the McCabe situation is that McCabe is accused of leaking in pushback to the Justice Department, saying that we are investigating Hillary Clinton, which happened to be accurate, but was not something he was supposed to be telling the newspapers. That's why he allegedly lied about leaking to it.
Would you
So
say,
McCabe, you know, there were some in the FBI who wanted to do this.
would you say it's somewhat, at least causes some red flags? For the Justice Department, it sounds, what you're alleging is that they were actively involved in trying to influence the election.
Oh, it sure does. I think this is an area that needs to be explored. I wish it had been explored by this Congress. It wasn't sufficiently. I know there was pushback from the DOJ, and I know there's all sorts of concerns about foreign interference in our elections, but when you have bureaucracies like the DOJ putting their thumbs on the scales, it's something that both parties ought to be concerned about because, you know, one day the shoe will be on the other foot, politically speaking, and we just want to be able to restrain the agencies from being their own arm of branch of government.
So this may be another way of asking a similar question, at least a similar train of thought. Why would the Justice Department try to pressure the FBI to stop a perfectly valid investigation?
For political reasons. I mean, there were other investigations that were ongoing at the time before that concerned President or then candidate Trump and Hillary Clinton. So the complaint about overt steps targeting the foundation seemed to be, well, not credible. That's why Mr. McCabe reacted so strongly.
Well, I believe what you've just said is the whole reason we're here. And Mr. Hackney, although I appreciate your opinion expressing why and how we need to do our oversight, what has just been said is the precise reason why we are doing oversight. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia. The chair recognizes ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Conley, the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I swear, Mr. Fitton, listen to your testimony. It's like being in Alice in Wonderland. The idea that why are we here? So let's just put ourselves in context because apparently none of this is happening in the real world. We just had a sentencing hearing in New York in which the president's personal attorney was given 3 years of jail time. This isn't speculation about what someone might have done. This is a crime admitted to. And in the sentencing, it was identified explicitly that individual number one coordinated and directed this illegal activity, for which Mr. Cohen is going to jail. Not speculative, not phony informants, not make-believe whistleblowers, not smearing or hearsay. This is now in the court record. You just made light, you almost dismissed, well, Russian interference in our election. That's a pretty big thing. And to compare the idea of somebody putting their thumb on the scales of justice in the Department of Justice to protect the Clintons, even though there's no criminal charge to that effect. And in fact, the FBI did look at it and found no there, not once but twice, Mr. Comey himself. We had Russian interference in our election. All of our intelligence community agrees with that. The FBI agrees with that. Most senior officials in the Trump administration with respect to foreign policy and law enforcement agree with that, except the president. We have criminal investigations, Mr. Fitton, not about the Clinton Foundation, but about the Trump Foundation. We have a ruling, and I'd like to enter that ruling, Mr. Chairman, into the record, from the Supreme Court of the State of New York saying there is sufficient grounds to go forward with a criminal investigation of the Trump Foundation, not the Clinton Foundation.
Without objection.
And we're not talking about it here because we're making a political point. Mr. Heiss says that's why we're here. Yes, why we're here is the grand Christmas miracle hope that we will distract the American public from the business at hand. That is grave and serious and undermines democratic institutions and norms. And Mr. Fitton, candidly, I would have expected more from Judicial Watch than your testimony. Mr. Hackney.
Can I respond briefly?
Briefly.
The concern is that
I made a statement, but if you wish to respond, I will.
the concern is the investigation of Russia attempts to influence our policy in the United States is geared at focusing on President Trump to the exclusion of what happened, Russian attempts to try to persuade or guarantee a positive result on the Uranium One scandal, and Russian admitted efforts by the Clinton campaign to base its dossier that was used to spy on President Trump with allegations generated by Russian intelligence.
Yep.
So if there was a broad investigation into the full panoply of what Russia was trying to do with respect to both parties, I think Americans of both parties would be more happy with that.
I think, and unfortunately, because of the issue of time, I'd be glad to give you more time later, but I would just say this committee, the Republican side, had an informant on the so-called Uranium One thing, and they held him from us for 3 months, and oh my God, this was going to be explosive testimony. And when we finally got a crack at him on a bipartisan basis, his testimony fell apart. He had no evidence of criminal activity of any kind. In fact, no evidence of quid pro quo. And here you are repeating a slander that has no factual basis behind it. Meanwhile, we have court evidence with respect to what's going on currently. Mr. Hackney, my time is limited, your IRS background. So these two witnesses, Republican witnesses who are litigants to a lawsuit, not whistleblowers, coming next, they wrote the IRS with a one-page summary of their so-called interview with Mr. Kessel. And the result, the reaction of the IRS to that request was a denial of the letter, of the request. You know IRS. Why in the world would the IRS deny something like that? How should we read that?
So I won't talk specifically to any particular organization or circumstances, but in terms of thinking about the IRS assessment of any particular whistleblower claim, it's going to be a number of considerations. Particularly, did someone bring actual credible information that leads to something that returns tax dollars in some way? And they must be concluding, forgive me there, if the IRS has made that choice within a Whistleblower Act, the primary thing must be that no one is bringing something to the table there. And I do want to note, I just wanted to say to Vice Chair Heiss, I agree fully that this committee has an important role in oversight. So,
and Mr. Chairman, just a unanimous consent request. Thank the Chair. Thank you both for testifying. I'd like to enter into the record our correspondence, Mr. Chairman. Our letter to you dated November 29th, requesting the broadening of this hearing. Your one-page response to us on December 4th, and our counter to that, our response to that on December 10th. I'd like to enter it into the record.
Without objection. I don't know that I've seen the December 10th letter, but I'm sure I will. I mean, today's the 12th, so maybe it's in the mail.
It's probably in the mail. I think my good friend knows I don't play surprises with him.
No, I know
operated
that,
on the assumption.
and that's why you get the grin that I agree with.
I thank
All right,
the Chair.
Thanks. All right. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan. For
I thank the Chairman. I just respond to my good friend from Virginia. We're not trying to distract anyone. We're just trying to stop this double standard that exists in our culture today. There's one set of rules for us regular folk, but it looks like to me a different set if you're part of the politically connected class. And that's all this is about. And we have two whistleblowers we haven't heard from. We're going to hear from them here in a second, and we'll find out what they have to say and hopefully get to the truth. So before I come to you, though, Mr. Fitton, I want to go to Mr. Hackney. Mr. Hackney, when did you work at the IRS again?
I was in the exempt organizations branch of tax-exempt government entities.
And what years?
2006 to April of 2011, I got an opportunity to join the faculty of Louisiana State University Law School, and it was an exciting opportunity.
Well, wonderful. We're happy for you. But you were there when the targeting of conservative groups started then, right?
Apparently it did, but I was not involved in any of that.
It says you were head of exempt, you advised the commissioner regarding exempt organization requirements. This all took place in the exempt organization division of the IRS.
But I did not handle any.
Didn't know anything about it?
I did not handle.
Did you work with Lois Lerner?
I did work with Lois.
But you didn't know anything about the be on the lookout list or anything like that?
I was not aware of those particular.
When did you first find out that the IRS was targeting conservative people and this whole double standard that I just mentioned was going on right in the very division that you were supposed to be advising and overlooking?
Sure, I appreciate the question. I would disagree with characterization of targeting, but I was at the meeting.
Well, you don't think people were targeted?
I don't believe they were. I think there was.
There was a list that
there have
had
been
3
reports at that
terms,
time.
9, 12, Tea Party, and conservative. If those terms come up, you got put on the list.
Yeah, I absolutely appreciate the question, and I
You don't think there was targeting? The President of the United States
I believe
at the
the
time said
IRS
there
was doing its best to do its job and didn't have the resources and was trying to find ways of accomplishing
This
that
isn't
job.
about resources. This is about targeting specific points of view, Mr. Hackney.
I understand that.
The Attorney General and the President of the United States had a big press conference when it became public and said, we're going to get to the bottom of this. They talked about possible criminal liability, and you're saying it didn't even exist in the very division that you were head of?
I'm not saying it didn't exist. I'm not saying that they were not looking at Tea Party organizations, but I'm also saying that they were looking at many different other organizations, as you'll see from various reports that came out later.
That is not true. That is not what the Inspector General said. And frankly, if it was just, we were looking at everyone the same, I don't think Lois Lerner would have taken the fifth when she sat right where you were sitting here today. But I got to get to Mr. Fitton in my last 2 minutes and 30 seconds here. $2 billion since 2001, right, Mr. Fitton? That's what the Clinton Foundation took in. Is that right? $2 billion?
Those numbers like that I've seen.
48 million in speeches, I think you said in your opening statements. That we did the math. You said like 200 something. That's like $250,000 for every single speech. He's pretty good. I mean, I've heard him speak, but that is amazing. And then you said in 2008, when Secretary Clinton became secretary, there was an agreement that I think in your testimony you said there were certain things she had to do. For the duration of her appointment, she would not be involved in all this money that the Clinton Foundation was taking in and all the speeches that her husband was doing, right? She wouldn't be signing off or making decisions about that. Is that right?
Yeah.
And the Clinton Foundation would disclose its donors. So there was an agreement that she worked out when she was Senate confirmed.
Right.
Okay. Did they follow the agreement?
No. And not in my view, at least.
So they had to get permission for her to be Secretary of State and continue to do all the things they did. They got permission, they got the okay, and then they didn't follow it.
No, they immediately began, the foundation immediately contacted Ms. Abidine, who worked closely with Mrs. Clinton, to start getting things done for foundation supporters, as I've described. And it's not what I described, the emails.
So the secretary, she kept her part of the deal, but she just had her lawyer, her chief of staff sign off on everything. Is that sort of how it worked?
Yeah, Abidine did the heavy lifting there, yeah.
Yeah. You think there's a double standard right now in America, Mr. Fitton?
Oh, yeah, Mrs. Clinton's being protected by, and was protected, and frankly still is being protected from the consequences of her behavior at the State Department and subsequently.
My colleague from Virginia talked about some things that have happened recently with Mr. Cohen, but I think it's interesting. I don't remember anyone associated, during the Clinton investigation, I don't remember anyone associated with the Clinton investigation. Well, first of all, they didn't even call it an investigation. Remember what they were told to call it?
Matter.
Yeah, we're supposed to call it a matter, right? It was obviously an investigation, but was told to be called a matter. I don't remember Cheryl Mills getting her door kicked in at 5 in the morning and having everything confiscated. I don't remember that at all. In fact, she worked out a deal ahead of time, got immunity before she even turned over any of her records or communications. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd like to, I would just love the committees or someone to investigate. We're doing it separately at Judicial Watch, but to find out whether or not, as report suggests, the Foundation investigation the FBI was conducting in 2016 was actively suppressed by the Justice Department and curtailed. Public reports are that FBI agents were only able to read newspaper articles as part of their investigation. They were denied subpoenas and other basic tools available to them.
Yeah.
And when you compare and contrast the special counsel investigation into President Trump and his associates, that's what a real investigation looks like,
Yeah.
abuses aside. We haven't had anything comparable even during the Clinton email issue.
Yeah.
Certainly this is tied to the Clinton email issue.
Mr. Chairman, I know I'm a little over time, but if I could real quick, I didn't expect to spend as much time on Mr. Hackney denying that there was targeting at the IRS. But you're, I think, exactly right. I've never seen this happen, Mr. Fitton, where the director of the FBI is fired, the deputy director is fired, the chief legal counsel is demoted, then leaves. FBI counsel Lisa Page is demoted, then leaves. And Peter Strzok, deputy head of counterintelligence at the FBI, is demoted and then fired. I've never seen that happen. But what's interesting, those are the same people who ran the Clinton investigation and started and launched the Russian investigation. Never seen that happen in any other federal agency, even as bad as the IRS was. They only had a couple of people, and none of them got fired. They just left. They're still getting a pension. So I've never seen anything like that. And the other thing that always strikes me as sort of interesting, and I'll close with this if I could, Mr. Chairman, is the names they gave the investigations, right? The Clinton investigation was the mid-year exam. But the investigation into possible coordination between the Trump campaign and Russia was Crossfire Hurricane. I like that. Just the name suggests a completely different approach and a completely different standard in how they're going to run the investigation. With that, I'd yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New York for a very generous 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank both panelists and my colleagues for being here. The Clinton Foundation is located in the district that I'm privileged to represent, so I've been able to attend many of their functions, conferences, to see firsthand some of the outstanding work that they are doing in New York and in my district. The foundation has supported physical education programs in 149 schools. Projects are underway to restore New York's harbor, provide free job training for homeless female veterans, and help hundreds of high school seniors prepare for graduation and college. And I have a whole list of things I would like to ask unanimous consent to put in the record their activities, Mr. Chairman, in my district in New York and across the country.
Without objection.
Now, I find it very ironic in this hearing today that the Republicans are targeting the Clinton Foundation, which is headed by two people who are out of office, who are not in government, yet there are other foundations where people are in government in very high positions, the Trump Foundation, the Whitaker Foundation, that they are not investigating. So I would suggest that we should be also investigating those foundations. So, Professor Hackney, I'd like to ask you about some of the allegations concerning the Whitaker Foundation, now the acting Attorney General. Before arriving at the Justice Department, he was the president and executive director of the Foundation for Accountability and Civic Trust, FACT. His charity was supposed to be focused on promoting ethics and transparency, and thus they had a tax-exempt status. But last month, the New York Times reported that FACT was paid more than $1.2 million in so-called dark money from undisclosed conservative donors. So, Professor Hackney, can you describe and explain dark money? What is it? And are there any concerns about when dark money is used to fund nonprofits like this one?
Absolutely. Dark money is a name given to money that comes into nonprofit organizations that are tax exempt, but nobody can see, at least the public can't see this money. Particular dark money organizations are social welfare organizations. These are advocacy organizations. They carry out work that often can take the look of politics, but may stay away from moving into FEC. As a result of not engaging in electoral activity where they'd have to disclose under campaign finance law, this money comes into a C4, C5, C6, labor unions, business leagues, and social welfare organizations. And in the past, the IRS at least knew, because there was a disclosure on Schedule B. The IRS recently removed that, so not even the IRS knows. This means that we don't know who's funding particular advocacy work that is moving towards elect particular candidates. It's dark.
Okay, well, we have legislation which we hope to pass as our first bill when we take over in January, which would disclose where this money is coming from. And that's not all. Last month, Mr. Whitaker released his financial disclosure form that showed that he received $900,000 over that from his foundation in 2016 and 2017. That's over $500,000 a year. Are you aware of what he did to deserve that kind of salary, Mr. Hackney?
I'm not going to speak to any particular organization, as I indicated.
Well, then are there regulations that govern how much
Absolutely.
in salary?
With a 501c3, the organization must pay a reasonable salary. And in order to determine what a reasonable salary is, you're supposed to go and look at what other people in a like spot are paying. Now, this is assuming that you are doing particular work and so on. It has to be a full facts and circumstances analysis of the work.
Well,
that's been
can you
done.
explain what law's fact this Whitaker Foundation may have violated?
Again, not going to talk specifically to fact in particular. One interesting aspect you had mentioned, there was a fund that came through. And I think it's worth mentioning donor-advised funds here. Donor-advised funds are accounts that individuals are able to set up with places like Fidelity and community foundations in the area. They're able to take an immediate deduction, but money doesn't necessarily flow to charitable purposes right away. The interesting thing with a donor-advised fund is that it is a public charity, and it can be used to make a charity that would otherwise be a private foundation into a public charity. I would love to have an opportunity to talk about that. That was an element of the private foundation regs. When an organization has one person that's donated a lot of money to them, we put them into private foundations instead, and they have restrictive rules that apply to them. This donor-advised fund move allows organizations to avert these private foundation rules.
Well, I think we should change that with law, too. Now, also, it showed that the FAC paid at least $500,000 to a Republican research firm known as America Rising. And according to its website, the mission of this organization is, quote, to help its clients defeat Democrats, end quote. Aren't 5013C supposed to be nonpartisan?
So I'll talk to that. There are two major rules that come in 501c3s. One, no electoral activity. You go out and say, elect Ms. Maloney or elect Chairman Meadows, you'll lose your exemption, technically. You also have limitations on lobbying. What often happens in this space, and that gets confusing, is there's a concept of education. If you're doing it in the context of a school, fine. If it's moving into another space, you can get into difficult spaces, and it's a very hard area for
my time is coming to an end, but this website, and I find this very disturbing, says that they gauge, this is in the website, you can go look it up today, quote, the relentless pursuit of original and effective hits against Democrats, end quote. This does not sound like a nonpartisan 5013C to me. It sounds like a political operative. I personally think that this should be investigated. And do you believe, Professor, that further investigation into FACT and its tax-exempt status is warranted, and how they were spending their money and why they were spending their money?
Professor, I don't want to speak specifically to
her
FACT.
time is expired. You can answer
But
that.
let me just say that the Republicans have refused to investigate current officials and current people who have these not-for-profits, and they are obsessed with continuing to investigate the Clintons many years after they have been in office. And and I think we should have investigations on these other two foundations, their tax-exempt
The
status.
gentlewoman's time has expired, and the
Thank you, Mr.
chair
Chairman.
has been extremely gracious with both sides, and so I'm going to recommend that we stay with our 5-minute timeline, starting with you, the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Blum, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Meadows. Thank you to our panelists for being here today. Quid pro quo. I had to look it up. It's Latin for something for something. A favor granted in return for something. In 2016, the Clinton Foundation received a $28 million donation from Morocco's King Mohammed. And shortly thereafter, Secretary of State Clinton relaxed U.S. foreign aid restrictions on Morocco. Mr. Fitton, was that a quid pro quo? Was that just a coincidence?
That's the matter that needs to be investigated. The foundation, the Clinton Foundation and its associated, the Global Initiative was able to raise tons of money during Mrs. Clinton's tenure as Secretary of State. And some of that was purely charitable, there's no doubt. It was purely charitable activities the foundation engaged in, as Congressman Maloney highlighted. But when you have these foreign governments making massive donations to the foundation and major corporations making massive foundations to the foundation, sometimes of which were out of line with other charitable activities, I think it's a fair question to ask what were they expecting in return, and was it a charitable enterprise, or were they just buying insurance? Now that may, or just making sure that they would get a better hearing over certain policies. But does it mean anything happened illegally? I don't know, but no one's asking the question.
Laureate University, $17.6 million to President Clinton, while Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, to be the honorary chancellor. I did not know that paid so well. The founder at that university has another organization called International Youth Foundation that received $40 million in grants while Secretary Clinton was in office. After she left office, the grants went from $40 million to a little over $3 million. Is that a coincidence, you think, Mr. Fenton?
I don't know. You have to ask the question. And this is why Mrs. Clinton promised these disclosures, and which makes it so problematic that these disclosures weren't followed as they were supposed to have been.
A Ukrainian.
We asked the State Department, give us the agreement. What did Mr. Clinton agree to do in exchange for that enormous amount of money? But that portion was blacked out by the State Department.
A Ukrainian oil and steel magnate, Mr. Pinchuk, donated between 10 to 25 million to the Clinton Foundation. In return, he was offered priority access to the State Department. Mr. Fenton, would you say it's quid pro quo?
It certainly seems that way.
And then lastly, and I know your organization has done some work on this, Mr. Fenton, the Uranium 1 deal. Those interests involved in that deal contributed more than $140 million to the Clinton Foundation. Mr. Fenton, could you fill this organization in on what happened in return for that $140 million in contributions?
Well, the State Department, in addition to other agencies, approved the goal of those entities, which was to get this stake in Uranium 1. And again, the FBI was looking into it, and the allegation is the FBI investigation was curtailed and silenced, or at least aspects of it were silenced from public disclosure to protect the Clintons and the Obama administration generally from controversy on this. And again, another area for investigation.
In your opinion, how would that happen? How would it be silenced? How would it be curtailed? How could that happen?
You don't pursue certain leads. You undercharge. In the case of the Uranium 1, I think the allegations were that some folks were being charged and a lot of issues were being left out of the documents or the charging documents or the cases that would have embarrassed some. Whether all of that is true or not, I don't know, because the Justice Department isn't giving us the documents.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have 33 seconds left. Let the record reflect. In Iowa, we have a saying: if it looks like a pig, if it sounds like a pig, and if it smells like a pig, it's probably a pig. And I think, based on what I read today, something smells here. I yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman from Iowa. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to establish what the standard should be. We understand here we had a President of the United States on the one hand and a Secretary of State on the other. It was a unique situation. So the absence of a standard is pretty clear. So we've got to look at the modus operandi for the foundation itself, because they were bound to be instances in which a foundation would look as though it was receiving some favoritism. And that's what happens, I suppose, when you have two very prominent people operating at this high corridor. So I thought I'd look at internal reviews by the Clinton Foundation. Now, these were voluntary reviews, and that's what interested me. Apparently, the foundation noted some issues, that there weren't as many governing board meetings as there should be. There was not timely reporting of conflicts of interest. Those are the kinds of things that might have been found by some investigation, but these were found by voluntary internal reviews by the foundation itself. Here again, I'm looking for a standard as to how a foundation should act in this kind of situation. Professor Hackney, do you think the kinds of internal reviews that were conducted by the Clinton Foundation are best practices? Is that how it should be done?
So again, I don't want to speak specifically to the Clinton Foundation, but as someone who actually goes out and trains directors to be directors of nonprofits, I certainly encourage rigorous and engaged discussion of a board. A board should be engaged in what's going on. The nature of various businesses is you'll have problems. I'm sure each of the members have had challenges in their organizations that they run, and it's important to do that kind of oversight. I deeply appreciate, as Mr. Heiss had noted, this committee is important. Doing the oversight is really important. It makes a difference in the functionality both of the government and the operations out there.
Thank you very much. That goes well beyond my question.
Yep.
Now, you look at the review that the Clinton Foundation did, it's fair to ask, well, what resulted? And here I am informed that they updated their conflict of interest policy. They reformed their vetting and gift acceptance policy. I'm not asking you to look at those particular reforms in a context you don't have. But are those the kinds of reforms or changes, I apologize for this cold, that you would expect a charity to make after commissioning reforms of the kind that I have just
So again,
indicated?
not as the Clinton Foundation, but I highly recommend a good conflict of interest policy and a good gift acceptance policy. They're critical to a nonprofit operation.
So there was always, given the fact that one was the president and one was the secretary, had been the president and one had been the secretary of state, you can see how difficult this situation was. Some employees who were interviewed had, in fact, this is information the committee has received, raised concerns about donors who might have an expectation of a quid pro quo benefit in return for gifts. Again, this is almost inherent in these two high-level officials operating in the same space. On the other hand, no evidence of a quid pro quo was ever found. So I have to ask you that, let me speak as a member of Congress. I'm sure that when some give contributions to me, they have an expectation of a quid pro quo. Does that mean that I am in fact guilty of some aura of quid pro quo for accepting such contributions?
So again, as to nonprofits, watching out for people wanting things from you in return is a big part of what you have to worry about in the basic nonprofit, and it becomes much more extreme as you have individuals who have additional power involved. It's a critical question they all have to ask.
And it is, and I can see the space in which these two were operating, Clinton and the Clinton Foundation and the Secretary of State. Mr. Chairman, could I note for the record that the Clinton Foundation has received ratings, 4 out of 4 stars from Charity Navigator, platinum rating from GodStar, an A rating from Charity Watch, and accreditation from the Better Business Bureau for meeting all 20 of its standards of governance, effectiveness, financing, and fundraising. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentlewoman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gozar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good seeing you, Mr. Fitton. Thank you. Now, is it true that the most recent filings for the Clinton Foundation have shown a significant drop-off in donations now that they have no political power?
I haven't seen the filings themselves, but there's been reports that there's been a 62% drop-off in donations.
So Sidney Blumenthal, a known political operative, was retained by the Clinton Foundation, correct?
Yes, I recall he was getting paid at $10,000 a month by the Clinton Foundation.
So now, while he was getting a rather large paycheck from the Clinton Foundation, he was also in Libya serving as then-Secretary Clinton's unofficial advisor, correct?
According to the New York Times and documents, I think, disclosed as a result in part by Judicial Watch's efforts, he sent Mrs. Clinton 25 memos on Libya.
He was also pushing his own financial interest by trying to get contracts, correct?
Yes, he worked for the Clinton Foundation and he had business concerns in Libya, it's been reported.
Is there an ethical concern with a known political operative working for a supposed nonprofit that is pushing for a war that he can profit from?
Well, maybe. I think the public interest here is that Mrs. Clinton promised she'd stay out of Clinton Foundation business, and she immediately and secretly started taking advice from a Clinton Foundation official, Sidney Blumenthal.
Now, as we turn this body over to the opposition party here and they launch fake investigations into foreign influence, I would like to take some time to ask the panel about real foreign influence, because I know they're not going to. Now, we continually see foreign governments and foreign entities funnel millions of dollars to environmental groups. 2 of the largest environmental groups in the world, the Natural Resources Defense Council and the Sierra Club, have received millions in grants from the Sea Change Foundation. The Sea Change Foundation itself got millions from a Bermuda company linked to Russia. As we all know, the environmental groups have undermined the energy sector in the United States. They've even got fracking banned in the cash-strapped state of New York. Now, if my friends across the aisle, the media and Mr. Mueller, were truly interested in Russian interference, would it make sense to start there, Mr. Fitton?
Oh, I've seen reports about that. The Russians obviously have an interest in making sure that competitors are harmed in the energy sector, and I'm surprised it has gotten more attention, their involvement in the environmental movement here in the United States.
So Russian money affecting U.S. policies that Russia benefits, it's incredible. In my other committee, the Natural Resources Committee, we're trying to investigate the relationship between the Natural Resources Defense Council and their links to Communist China government. The NRDC has gotten cozy with the environmentally unfriendly Chinese government while suing the U.S. government whenever it can, particularly the U.S. Navy and its weapon development programs. Now, I'm sure I don't need to remind anyone here that China sees the U.S. Navy as its greatest foe. Mr. Fitton, should a nonprofit be made to register as a foreign agent if it is taking funds and orders from a foreign government that is trying to harm U.S. national and energy security?
Maybe. One of the things I noted about the Clinton Foundation activities is that Doug Bann and others were always advocating on behalf of foreign nationals, which raised an issue of the Foreign Agents Registration Act as well. But certainly, if my understanding of the law is that there would be registration requirements potentially if you're essentially taking orders from a foreign government and beholden to them financially.
Now, nonprofits like the Open Society Foundations have been giving billions from wealthy benefactors. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, now while there's nothing wrong with someone giving their money to an organization like Open Society, there is a problem when the federal government doles out millions of dollars in grants to these organizations. For instance, the National Immigration Law Center received hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants from the federal government and over $1 million from the Open Society Foundation while working against U.S. interest. Does it make sense to dole out taxpayer funds to groups that not only look to erode U.S. sovereignty, but are against official U.S. positions, Mr. Fitton?
Well, I think it's controversial. I think what also would be controversial is that the Soros operation and Mr. Soros' foundations, I think, is going to spend about $1 billion this year. As you point out, mostly of his own money is subsidized in part by U.S. tax dollars. And he's a controversial figure in terms of his policy outlooks. And I question why it is tax dollars are supporting him.
It's definitely, one last comment, Mr. Chairman. You know, when we start looking at nonprofits, I actually was part of a nonprofit, and you're rated about how much of your dollar goes to the mission statement of what you detail. So, for example, a good nonprofit, 97 cents of every dollar goes to that mission statement. And listening to Mr. Hackney, I now notice that the Clinton Foundation was very top-heavy with a lot of employees, a lot of exorbitant travel, and not really a dollar-wise penny spent. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes Ms. Watson-Coleman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. Mr. Fitton, let me ask you something very quickly. Before your position with Judicial Watch, what were your various jobs?
I work for other conservative nonprofits, Accuracy in Media.
Have you ever worked for government?
Government? No. Well, back when I was a kid, I worked for the town, but
Have you ever worked for a Republican elected official?
no.
Thank you.
I always worked in the nonprofit sector.
Thank you. Today, we're holding this hearing again. This is another hearing in a multi-year investigation of the Clinton Foundation, completely on unsubstantial allegations. But at the same time, we refuse to do anything, not I, to investigate various serious allegations related to the Trump administration, Foundation, both. Last month, a state judge in New York ruled that prosecutors could proceed with legal action against the Trump Foundation for allegations focusing on, and I quote, the misuse of charitable assets and self-dealing, close quote. Let me read from that judge's ruling, quote, the petitioner also alleges that charitable assets, primarily consisting of money donated by outside sources, were used to promote Mr. Trump's properties, purchase personal items, advance Mr. Trump's presidential election campaign, and settle certain personal legal obligations. Professor, is the judge's ruling an indication that the allegations against the Trump Foundation are creditable?
I don't want to speak directly to Trump Foundation.
Speak to whether or not your perspective on the judges.
Yeah, I mean, when a judge finds something, that is a finding in the public record. It becomes a part of the public record.
And what was your sort of reaction to this notion of self-dealing?
I, again, don't want to speak specifically to the Trump Foundation. It's a major issue within private foundations when wealthy individuals put significant money and use it for their own purposes, but that's not as to the Trump.
Would you agree that this foundation, this Trump Foundation, is worthy of congressional oversight?
I believe the entire nonprofit sector is worthy of oversight. I think
that would
it's really
include
important.
this foundation?
Absolutely.
Professor, on June 15th, you wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about the Trump Foundation. In that piece, you wrote, and I quote, as a former attorney for the chief counsel of the IRS, who specialized in nonprofit organizations, I believe Mr. Trump is also criminally liable for his actions. If I were still at the IRS based on the lawsuit, I would make a criminal referral on charges of tax evasion or false statements on a tax return or both. Why specifically do you believe Mr. Trump is criminally liable for his actions regarding the Trump Foundation? And how serious do you consider the crimes of tax evasion or making false statements on tax returns?
So again, I'm not going to speak to the Trump Foundation here. My writing speaks for itself, and
Let me ask you a question about that.
Sure.
You wrote an op-ed article. You're here testifying, and there have been specific questions to you. Why are you suddenly unwilling to answer specifically regarding the purpose for which we are here today?
And
We're not here.
the chair would weigh in on this. Let me just say that the gentlewoman makes a point. If you've written an op-ed, you can't all of a sudden, as much as I might like you to not comment on it, you can't not do that. I mean, she's asking a legitimate question. You need to answer it, Mr. Hackney.
Let me go there. So charity matters deeply, and it matters deeply that the people who file returns take care to do the things that they intend to do.
So, Professor,
And when they take that money, and if they use it in ways over a series of years that's problematic, and they sign that return in those instances where it is over a period of time, I think that's significant and does warrant a discussion of criminal.
So do you believe what you wrote?
I do.
Do you stand by what you wrote?
I stand by what I wrote.
Okay. In your op-ed, you also are quoted as saying, the IRS saves criminal consequences for notorious and continuous violations of the law. And the misuse of a charity for personal and political purposes over the years, as alleged by the New York State Attorney General, is in fact the type of case that the IRS goes after with criminal sanctions. What notorious and continuous violations of the law were you referring to that you believe that were committed by the Trump Foundation?
And so, Mr. Hackney, her time is expired, but you can answer the question.
Just very quickly, there's been a series of representatives, and I did not study up for that specifically right now, but there's been a series of representatives have used their charities. There was even one recently, I think, out of my state of Pennsylvania. I'm not positive about that, but there have been a series of ones that the IRS has brought in those contexts.
Thank you. You know, Professor, you have frustrated me.
I apologize.
Because you are a person who has written what you believe. You are a professor, you are a scholar, you are a former IRS employee, and then you can't even feel comfortable in supporting what you've already said in writing. With that, I yield back.
I do support it.
The chair recognizes himself for a series of questions. Mr. Hackney, let me follow up on Ms. Watson-Coleman. How many pages of the documents the Trump Foundation and their filings have you reviewed?
I've reviewed all of their 990 PFs over a long period of time.
Yeah, but 990, it doesn't tell the whole story.
The tax returns that the IRS has filed. I've also reviewed the public record in terms of the reports made by David Fahrenthold.
In terms of what is their internal documents, would you be qualified to provide an audit in terms of what they've done or not done, based on the documents you've reviewed?
I'm not certain of the question.
Based on the documents you've reviewed,
Yep.
would you be qualified to be able to give an opinion on an audit of the Trump Foundation?
So I think you're asking, have I seen every single possible document out there? And I have not seen every possible document out there. I'm doing based on what the public record is, and that was it that I had done in that.
So based on public record, you're saying that there's enough in the public record to say that there should be a criminal referral, Mr. Hackney? You know, you're a law professor. I mean, I would find that just unimaginable.
I think that's different than saying that he's definitely, in
It is
there I
different,
discussed to the fact that.
But my question remains, are you saying there's enough in the public domain to refer it as a criminal matter?
I believe there were, in the instance
And
where.
you're under oath, so
I understand.
And you're a law professor, so I want to see your students be able to answer this accurately.
Absolutely. I believe where we know that there is a high likelihood that there have been false statements in a return and there have been choices.
And how do you know that?
It appears that there were false statements.
Appears and know are two different words.
I understand what you're saying.
So you don't know.
I I believe based on the public record, and that was what I was writing it based upon.
So based on a public record, you think there's enough for a criminal referral?
I believe that in that report that there was enough to show possible problems there. But again, I don't want to go into that, and I did not prepare to talk to specific facts. This hearing was called at the last minute, and I have not had that time.
Well, you as a witness were called at the last minute by the minority, so I just want to make sure that that's clear.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman.
So let me go a little bit further, Mr. Fitton. I want to talk about, everybody's talking about how great the Clinton Foundation is and how above board and A ratings and platinum ratings and gold ratings and all of this. There is a report from November 10th of 2008, which is an internal audit. It actually comes from an internal audit that has a conclusion. It says, the challenges and deficiencies plaguing the foundation cannot be overstated. There are real and undermine the organization's effectiveness immediately and more long-term. To address these issues that present immediate threats, the foundation should revamp its legal and HR operations, should review its governance structure and documents, and should have an open and honest discussion with the President about the future of the foundation. Would you not find that alarming if that was the conclusion of an internal audit, Mr. Fitton?
I wouldn't want to get an audit like that.
So,
the problem is there's another audit in 2000.
yeah, you got a microphone.
Oh, there was another audit in 2011 that raised some of the same issues.
Well, that's
not as directly, but suggesting that.
well, that's where I was going, and I appreciate you mentioning that because that was in 2010, and then another audit in 2011, as you talk about, by a very different firm, talked about the potential conflicts of interest and the fact that those conflicts of interest policies that were suggested to be put in place. However, this is a quote, however, we did not find any evidence of the enforcement of the conflict of conflict of interest. Are you saying that in your discovery process with Foia that there is a potential conflict of interest between the charitable mission of the Clinton Foundation and what might have been going on? Have you found that?
Yes. Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Clinton and the foundation recognized those potential conflicts of interest and tried to reassure the President Obama and the Senate that they would be taken care of and disclosed. And as I said, they were either rubber stamped or key aspects of it weren't disclosed. And or in the case of Mrs. Clinton, she directly started violating her own agreement by dealing with this Sidney Blumenthal and allowing her staff to, on a regular basis, take care of Clinton Foundation interests using public resources.
Mr. Fitton, is it likely, based on reports that you've seen, is it likely that the special counsel is also looking into things other than Russian collusion narratives for President Trump, based on reports that you've read? Are they looking into other matters as it relates to President Trump?
Oh, yes, I would assume the Southern District investigation, the campaign finance allegations that have been raised up there were as a result initially of interest from the special
Is it
counsel.
likely that they're looking into the Trump Foundation as well?
It wouldn't surprise me.
Okay. Based on your testimony, I guess what I'm trying to figure out, if the special counsel is looking at that, why would Attorney General Eric Holder not have looked into some of the issues as it related to the Uranium One deal? And why would they have looked the other way? Because apparently, according to your testimony, they did not know whether the FBI or DOJ ever alerted the committee members to criminal activity that they uncovered. And that was a quote from your written testimony. The investigation was ultimately supervised by U.S. Attorney Rod Rosenstein and Andy McCabe. Isn't it amazing how these names continue to show up? Isn't it amazing? And with that, if there's no further business before this panel, we will excuse you two gentlemen. We thank you for your testimony, and we'll ask the next panel to be set up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.